Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible episode for you guys. So sit back and relax and enjoy this latest episode. The big topic we're going to talk about today, I think a lot of people could tell that by my tweeting what I was going to talk about. But, of course, we're going to be talking about the right's 90s nostalgia. You've been seeing this all over the place. You're talking, and you will see any conservative being like, we didn't have these problems back in the 90s. Like, why can't we return to the 90s? You know, people want to bring back Seinfeld. They want to bring back Collective Soul on the radio. You know, they want to bring out their grunge gear, and they're ready for the 90s again. And so you're seeing this. I'm being a little exaggerated when I say, you know, conservatives see the 90s as the golden age, as the golden era of time that they should return to. But increasingly, they treat it as that, even though most conservatives, if you get them down to it, they're like, well, you know, maybe it wasn't quite the golden age, but it was a lot better than what we have today. And you just didn't have any of these problems. It was so great. I wish we could return. And so that's basically what they say. And it has supplanted the 50s as the ideal time period among conservatives. And there's obvious reasons for that. I mean, one, very few people remember the 50s now, but a lot of people remember the 90s. And it's also much easier to remember the 90s when you have, you know, you can go on YouTube and you can watch old commercials, old TV shows, old music videos from that time, and you can live out your youthful glory days thanks to YouTube and the power of the internet. So that's how a lot of people get into this stuff. So I'm going to address 90s nostalgia, whether it's really good. I think some people realize my answer on that. And delve into why it's so appealing, why people are so, like, you know, see the 90s as a golden era, and whether it's this nostalgia is rooted in truth. Because there's a political and cultural aspect to the 90s nostalgia. I mean, 90s nostalgia has been around for a while. I mean, I remember in the early 2010s, like 2010, like people started talking about how people now have 90s nostalgia, especially among the millennials. Because, I mean, millennials, were still the young people at that time. When old people were complaining about young people and they're complaining about millennials, it was actually millennials they were complaining about, not Zoomers. As today you'll see, like, boomers complaining about millennials, and they're talking about college and high school kids, and it's like millennials haven't been college and high school kids for a while, but they still complain about millennials, the damn millennials. So I remember in 2010, that there was this outburst of it. You know, they're bringing back old cartoons on Nickelodeon just to appeal to the millennial audience. People are talking about how awesome the 90s were on TV. And so that was already there developing with millennials, which in some ways it was millennials pining for when they were days as children, and there was, the stress and responsibility of becoming an adult. And they're like, I just wish I could go back in time to when I was a kid and I didn't have any responsibilities. And, there was the recession that had been played. It really screwed a lot of millennials. So a lot of them just wanted to return to childhood. And that's really what a lot of it was about. But it's changed to now a more of a political thing, or what I'm really discussing is more of a political thing rather than a social or cultural thing, with millennials just wishing to be teenagers or even really preteens or younger for eternity. It's something different now with how the right treats it politically. And, really the inspiration for this podcast, or this podcast topic and the tweets about it, was a Matt Walsh tweet saying that, like, back in the 90s, no one saw race and everyone just, saw each other as human beings, I guess. And this was his thrust, is that there were no racial tensions in the 90s, which is just false. I mean, it's plainly false. I mean, the early 90s had a major white backlash. And this was found in the David Duke semi-successful political campaigns. I mean, David Duke nearly won statewide office twice. I forget if it was governor or senator, which he came the closest to winning. I think it was governor, where he came closest to actually winning. and he was somehow the Republican nominee for governor. I think this was in '91, and he had won. He had become a state representative as well. And so he was like a major player, and he was like on national TV. Like, I mean, people compare like David Duke to some of the clowns who were in the alt-right, who really just got a lot of media attention but didn't really have much of a following. But David Duke actually had a pretty sizable national following in the 90s, early 90s. And people were really responding to his message. When he would go on national TV, you know, there'd be a lot of people like, yeah, I agree with him. While with the alt-right, it being like, check out these freaks. And generally, the guys who are getting interviewed would play into that role, would lean into that role to being freaks rather than trying to appeal to their audience. So that was a brief period for David Duke. And then there was just the backlash. Pat Buchanan had his, two insurgent primary presidential campaigns in 92 and 96. There was a backlash in California through Pete Wilson, who was governor, who, when he ran for governor in 94, he was like all about immigration. Immigration was a major focus of the campaign when he was running. This was a clear focus of Pete Wilson of what he wanted, and there was he passed. Let me get it. Let me get this 100% correct. But yeah, they passed a measure to crack down on illegal immigrants that was overwhelmingly backed by Californians. There was a massive backlash to affirmative action. There was also referendums on that in California. And so this was like being, and Republicans were also openly talking about eliminating affirmative action. And this wasn't necessarily a way of just like showing that no one's seeing race. It is part of this white backlash that was happening throughout the 90s. And there's also the LA riots, clearly racial in focus. The O.J. Simpson trial, which was a clearly racial thing, even though all these people tried to insist it wasn't. They're like, there was no race here. What racial angle? And it's like, yeah, a black guy killed or is accused of killing two white people. No, and all the blacks are saying that he's just being charged because of racism. No race angle there. They're just seeing this as individuals. It's like somebody going back in the past and pretending there was nothing racial to Trayvon Martin. But people kept insisting that with OJ. Illegal immigration was highly debated. Immigration was debated. And there was also a lot of push in movies to have these racial woke angles. Pretty much any black movie that you would have seen, like the 1995 film Higher Learning, which was the director who did Boys in the Hood. It was like either his second or third film after Boys in the Hood, and it was all about like racial conflict on college campuses. There are several other examples of that, just like a TV show where they would have like an anti-racism episode. It was the height of white nationalism 1.0 at that time in the 90s. So, and militia movements as well. Oklahoma City bombing, even though you might not say that was like anything specifically racial, there was that type of violence going on in the country. There was a Million Man March, which was brought about by Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. It didn't quite have a million men, but it was a very large gathering of, it was at least over 100,000. I think it was maybe under 500,000, but like a sizable amount, like 400,000 if I'm not mistaken, who showed up. And it's like, it was a very much of a black nationalist thing, implicitly, not explicitly, because there was more moderate black leaders who were there. I think Jesse Jackson, some others spoke there, who aren't on the same level as Louis Farrakhan. But that was like a major demonstration, and that was like not blacks simply saying, "Oh, we're forgetting about our racial identity. We're colorblind now." No, it's like we're showing up in Washington D.C. to demonstrate ourselves as black men, as black identity. We're taking our people back, and we're trying to reform them. It was somewhat driven by it was driven by some conservative impulses about like the problems within the black community of crime. Single mothers, broken families, and it was all these men like marching to show like, hey, we're standing up to save our people. And so it was not a post-racial mindset. It wasn't like the million men of all colors. We're just not seeing race. The Million American Men March, it was like the Million Black Man March. And so that was like that type of racial feeling was there, especially among blacks. And Even at that time, the rap music was like very much into supporting black nationalist identity. There was these New York rappers who were getting into five percenter, not like the five percenters who are now forgotten from who apparently lost the election for Trump or helped secure Donald, or I almost called him Donald Biden, who helped secure the election for Joe Biden. The Wignats who are just saying that they're like, oh, we're the 5% of white men who didn't vote for Trump and we cost them the election, which previously they hadn't even been talking about the election, but there was different five percenters who were like a crazier offshoot of Nation of Islam. A lot of the New York rappers were into that. A lot of the guys around Wu-Tang Clan, Busta Rhymes, some others were into five percenter stuff. And even before that, there was all these bands who were having these black nationalist messages, like Ice Cube. Ice Cube had like all these albums that were all about Nation of Islam themes. You can watch his old videos of him. There's like one video of him where he's kidnapping these black guys who he thinks that are selling out the black race through like having white girlfriends or acting white or being the white's puppet. And it's like a clear denunciation of interracial coupling among blacks. And he was like openly, celebrating Nation of Islam rhetoric. There was other groups like A Tribe Called Quest that were indulging in that. And that's made fun of in that Wayans Brother movie where you guys have seen the clip. But it was like, I'm blacker than black, 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 black. That's making fun of the black nationalism that was prevalent in rap in the time. And that was the early 90s. So there was very much like these racial feelings throughout the country in pop culture and elsewhere, primarily located mostly in the first half of the 90s, even going on to the opposite level with like these metal bands that were still popular at the time, like Pantera. I mean, Pantera on stage, like Phil Anselmo would go on these how you need to have white pride speeches. And Pantera was topping the charts at the time. They were a big band. And they were going on about like, when are they going to talk about black on white crime? And he would give these like speeches from, the stadiums that they were performing at. And so that was like even a thing like among some of the metal and rock bands that they were getting into that, seeing the world through a racial lens. And most of like Rush Limbaugh's controversial race comments were made in the 90s, and he was like the #1 radio talk show host. So people were definitely seeing race at the time, both from like a woke angle or the left-wing angle or a minority angle, as well as there being this white backlash at the time. And the white backlash mostly dissipated due to the thriving economy that occurred later on in the 90s as the 90s progressed. I mean, the economy was not good in the early 90s. Pat Buchanan, when he was running in the 92, he's talking about like how like deindustrialization, all the massive amount of problems, economic problems that were happening under George H.W. Bush. But over time, the economy began to prosper, and that reduced the feeling of white backlash, along with declining crime rates, because the crime rate, I believe, hit its peak in 91, or at least the murder rate did. In the early 90s, New York was hitting 2,000 murders per year, and most cities prior to last year were having their murder records in the early 90s. Philadelphia, for one, I think Washington, D.C., a bunch of others, they all had their murder records in the early 90s, but the crime rate due to crime bill, tougher policing, and other measures that we're now eliminating, the crime went down throughout the 90s. And so people began having, and we're also like America's the lone superpower left. The Cold War is over. We don't have to worry about nuclear annihilation anymore. We can do whatever we want in the world, as we were able to do in the Balkans, and we're just like the #1 superpower. We've got an incredible economy. Friends is on. we just bought the new Counting Crows album. We're back. America rules. Let's go. And some people like that. That's what they're pining for, but. And the wokeness and the political correctness was all there. Like, all of the problems we have today were there in the 90s. They were just not as bad. And the one thing that I think a lot of people I was about to say nostalgically, I guess that works, back to the 90s, is that America looked better. Or it felt more like you felt less alienated from it. Because America at that time was whiter and it was thinner as well. These are two important factors. America's racial makeup was over 70% white at that time. You could see random public events and you'd see a sea of white faces. Like I talk about this with Woodstock 99. When I watched that documentary on it last year and reviewed it for an IQ supplement, I was like, the thing that struck me was how white the event is, and they even attacked it. The leftists who did the documentary, they were attacking it for being too white and toxic white masculinity as they're seeing this. And you're just like looking at this event, and you're like, outside of like college football games and pro golf tournaments, you will never see this many white people gathered in one place in America at that time. It's just like, and it was like considered a wild, rowdy, prolish thing to go to Woodstock 99, and yet it's like extremely white event, and it's like something you just won't see at the time. And it's also like you're not seeing a ton of morbidly obese people at that in the 90s as well. The obesity rate was pretty high, but it was below 25% for the decade. Now we're over 40%, and I think it might be up to 45%. And it's, any public place you go, you'll see obesity. And this is also higher overweight as well. I mean, like the majority of the population is now overweight. That wasn't necessarily the case in the 90s. So you saw more, you just saw thinner, you saw more white people and saw more thin people. And I think that may have made people happier. Is like, oh, if you go out to a public setting, if you go to an airport, it's not dystopian. It's not like a nightmare that you just woke up to when you went to these public places. It is a lot nicer to go into these public places. But that's driven by these factors that some people will bring up the obesity factor, but a lot of these conservatives are not going to bring up the demographic factor. And also when it comes to the racial element, a lot of the reason that was maybe more colorblind is that not only were we whiter, but like the racial dynamic was primarily black and white. Even though Hispanic population was rising at that time, I think it hit, it was about to hit over 10% in the 90s. But it was still primarily white and black. And also Hispanics were still primarily relegated to the Southwest and areas where near the border and a few major cities. They were not like spread out everywhere in every city. And even in like a rural area, you'll find like a Mexican enclave or a Central American enclave. And that wasn't necessarily the case back in the 90s. But we did have a president who looked for the days that when America would no longer be majority white. He said, Bill Clinton at the time said that, the third great revolution in American history will be us becoming more diverse, will be us losing our majority status. And he was talking about how great this is going to be for a country that we're no longer going to be majority white. And it wasn't just Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton was saying this, but George H.W. Bush, and his brief time during the early 90s was making it possible. He passed the Immigration Act of 1990, which roughly tripled immigration and ensured that more of the third world could come here. He also strengthened the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1991. And this is a Republican president. And this is supposedly when we had triumphed over political correctness. Like political correctness was put in the dust. And we have a president who's celebrating America turning into a minority country, the Democrat, and then the Republican is passing policies to ensure it happens. And this is what we're supposed to be proud of. And so the argument that a lot of people like to make is that they did have this political correctness wave in the late 80s and 90s, but it was defeated. And the evidence that they use to say it was defeated is they point to the movie PCU, which wasn't even a box office hit. But the mere existence of this movie, which lightly poked fun at the excesses of political correctness, showed that political correctness was soundly defeated, that it was like vanquished, that we no longer had to worry about that. And they'll just point out these other examples like, well, like this, there's a Simpsons episode from the 90s or this South Park episode. This couldn't be made today, and this showed that political correctness was totally in retreat. And there is a kind of a point where they have when it comes to college campuses and its effect on wider society. I got this argument a lot when I wrote my book, No Campus for White Men. I was talking with people, and the people would bring up the 90s example, and they said, like, well, we experienced this wave in the 90s, but it died out. These kids aged out of it, and they grew up, and, that stuff wasn't around. And they were saying, like, you saw a lot of the same arguments that you see now back then in the 90s. And that was true. And there was more of a moderate liberal mockery or denunciation of the excesses of political correctness. I mean, Bill Clinton had this famous Sister Soldier moment where he criticized some random black rapper who made anti-white comments, and he just upheld this woman. I don't think anyone has ever heard of Sister Soldier before outside the Bill Clinton campaign in '92. And he was like pointing this out to show that he's a moderate. He's on the side with the ordinary independents who are worried by left-wing extremism and excesses of political correctness. And so that's an example of it. But that stuff remained. And the difference is today you don't have Democrats doing Sister Soldier moments. They're like inviting Sister Soldier to come campaign for them, or praising him and giving them a Congressional Medal of Freedom. That's like the difference between now and then. Joe Biden would just like say like, that's a great song. I'm going to start playing it at my campaign events. And so that was like, so they no longer want to appear to be moderate or appeal to the center. They just, double down on being loonies. So that's the difference between Democrats and today. But like that political correctness stuff, that stayed there. The college campuses, it wasn't just suddenly all the professors like, oh, wow, people are making fun of me in the movie PCU. Well, I guess it's over for me. I guess we're done with political correctness. I'm defeated. No, they just stayed there, and they kept telling this to future, to more kids. And so a lot of those students back then, it was more restricted to college campuses. But over time, over 20 years, it then broke out outside of college campuses. And it still was even having an effect on TV and media. There was a major push to ensure that there was sufficient diversity in these movies. This is back then. This is in the 90s. It started to be where they would have more forced diversity in casting. You can see that maybe in like Jurassic Park, where like the really bright black scientist is a black guy, and that's in several other movies. Independence Day with Will Smith. These are probably not that like egregious or like that offensive. Like, who cares that like Will Smith is like the protagonist of Independence Day? But that does show that there's like this diversity push there, that they want to, their movies and TV shows to reflect the new diverse America that Bill Clinton is extolling as this grand revolution in American life. And so there was that push there. And generally, they would not go into these, black nationalists or anti-white diatribes in this. And it generally would be, we'll all come together and get along under a colorblind mindset. And that was more the standard that they wanted everyone to see, is like, race doesn't exist. We're all part of the human race. Let's just unite as Americans, and that's how we'll extinguish our differences. But they were encouraging, black identity as well at that time. It wasn't they were trying to tell blacks to stop seeing themselves as blacks. No, they were encouraging that for them. It was just telling whites to be colorblind rather than to adopt like extreme anti-white guilt for themselves. So it was about the same message directed to blacks, but a different message directed to whites. I mean, if you were in elementary school at the time, they were teaching about Kwanzaa. All the kids' TV shows were talking about Kwanzaa. And they were talking about Black History Month. And, that was there back then. We also had Martin Luther King Day. And these were explicitly black things. And it wasn't just like, nobody saw race. It's like, how are we nobody seeing race if we have Black History Month? And if we have, like, white kids having to learn about Kwanzaa and how it promotes a special black identity for blacks. And it's like, there's people who are seeing race. Now, the elevation of the 90s is like the golden era that conservatives want to return to. That is an interesting development. Now, I mentioned earlier, of course, the reason why it's replaced in the 50s is that no one remembers the 50s. Well, or I'm not going to say everyone, but most people remember the 90s. And, conservatism is built on the idea of longing for the past. Nostalgia is a major part of it. It's always been a major part of conservatism going back throughout the years. And the 50s made more sense as the time to pine for because, one, it wasn't like an ancient past, or it wasn't a past that you could feel that you could not return to. It wasn't like, somebody in 1990 wanting to return to the 1810s or wanting to return to the pre-industrial age. You know, 50s is not as radically different from the time period of the late 20th century, early 21st century as the late 90s, early 21st century is from the pre-industrial age, which is that some past conservatism we're all obsessed about or like the Middle Ages or something. It was a past that you could see returning in some form. And the reason why people like the 50s is that, we had a massive amount of economic prosperity, triumphant Americanism. We just won World War II. We are now a superpower along with the Soviet Union. There was a wholesome culture, or the appearance of a wholesome culture that people would have interacted with through TV and radio and advertising. We were also nearly 90% white at the time. Largely, it's hard to say it's a completely homogenous country because there were still a lot of these very strong ethnic enclaves. But, if you're growing up in the suburbs, there is this, and you're watching TV, there's this appearance of a homogenous America that has strong cultural or conservative values. This is there was also a resurgence of religiosity, church attendance increased. Dwight Eisenhower added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. So it was really this time that you would say this is a genuinely conservative time period. Even though there have been people pointing out that that's not necessarily true of the entire picture, but the memories were usually correct of why they're pining for that time. It's a simpler time. They're turning on the TV, they're not seeing violence and sexuality, and they're seeing, wholesome conservative content that you would see, like I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver. That's what they're seeing. The 90s doesn't make sense when it comes to that. And also, you have to, the religious right was still a major player back in the 90s. And when there was still a cultural war fight at that time, I point out this speech a lot, but Bob Dole made this major culture war speech in a way to head off conservative rivals in the 1996 presidential campaign. And when he went up there, he basically said that America has a hellish culture. There's gangster rap, there's death metal. I mean, he condemned Cannibal Corpse by name. That's not necessarily a band that's getting played on the radio, but Bob Dole somehow knows about Cannibal Corpse. And he's deploring all these violent movies that are being put on. And he is essentially saying that the culture we have is depraved and we must change it. But now the conservative golden era, it's like, oh, the culture was amazing. This is so wholesome. It's like, instead of Leave It to Beaver, you have Friends or Seinfeld, which, compared to what we have today, I mean, they're not exactly, no one would call them degenerate filth or something, but it's not exactly wholesome entertainment. It's not made for kids, and it's not portraying this type of proud suburban American ideal that you would have seen displayed in 50s and 60s TV shows. The 90s, you had Natural Born Killers, Pulp Fiction, these are the movies that are coming out. And at that time, conservatives were horrified by this stuff. I remember once reading a movie review of Seven, the movie Seven. I mean, of course, most people are familiar with the movie Seven, by John Podhoretz. And Podhoretz was not really a social conservative. He's a standard neoconservative, whatever. And he's reviewing this movie as it's the worst filth imaginable. It's just so violent and depraved. How dare they make movies now? Flash forward 20 years later, John Podhoretz is eagerly live tweeting the latest prestige TV show that's full of rape, torture, and horrific mutilations and violence that would put Seven to shame. And he's like, this is awesome. And they're just all live tweeting it. And that's every conservative pundit is now live tweeting and talking about they're watching the latest prestige TV show that is far worse when it comes to content than something like Seven. But in the 90s, all these conservative publications, National Review, Weekly Standard, were all deploring the horrible culture that was around them in that way. So, I mean, in that point, saying there, we're moving to, I mean, in hindsight, it looks a lot better, but conservatives at the time thought they were living in a country that was going to hell in a handbasket. Robert Bork, the famous, almost Supreme Court justice, famous lawyer, wrote this book called Slouching Towards Gomorrah. This is actually the first article I ever wrote for a website under my own name, actually just period. I wrote was a review of Slouching Towards Gomorrah. I think I wrote it for the Youth for Western Civilization website. And I wrote it, and the whole book is like essentially seeing America through this dystopian vision. And it was a bestseller, and that really captured conservative views of America at the time. But now it's like conservatives just... It would be like if National Review started in the 1950s, and its whole purpose was saying that we are living in a hellhole and the culture around us is completely evil and sinister, and we just have to get rid of it. And then 20 years later, the same National Review is talking about how the 50s were the golden age and we have to return to the 50s. And that's very much what like the conservative movement is now when it comes to the 90s. Now, some of it's just like changing more, mores of what people are about and norms and standards. Conservatives back in the 90s would have, been still openly criticizing rock music, and now they're talking about their favorite rap album. And that's like the average conservative pundit. And the average conservative pundit is much more of a participant in modern culture than the conservative pundit of years past. The best example of that is their obsession with every prestige TV show, from Game of Thrones to onward. Like, they talk about prestige TV more than any demographic that I know. And a lot of this stuff has messages that, conservatives of years past would have been horrified by, or content that they would have been horrified by. And it said that, TV should ban it. And even at that time, conservatives were still trying to ban like music and movies and TV shows and like launching boycott campaigns against this. And now today, like, conservatives like don't boycott any form of media. I mean, the only thing I can really think of is like Cuties from Netflix, which was, that's like the one example of this. But, they really did try to cancel stuff in the 90s, from video games, music onward. And they're still leading these censorship pushes, if you want to call them that. And today, now they just like enjoy all these things, but then they're like, I wish it wasn't so woke, or something of that sort. I mean, they were to all try to ban like Quake and Doom in the 90s, just for being too violent. But today, no conservative will even bother to boycott the NFL for saying football is gay and we stand with Black Lives Matter, and they'll get mad at anyone who tells them to boycott it. And so, if different faces of conservatism are what they're trying to accept and tolerate. So I return to this point. I've been saying a lot about the modern conservatism, a lot of these populist think types and what they want. And they present themselves as very radical, but oftentimes what they're espousing is merely, 1990s liberalism. And the pining for the 90s and the 90s nostalgia is part of that. And them imagining that this is the height of Clinton liberalism is the peak of America and is what we need to return to. And the education the type of educational material that is being taught to children, rather than critical race theory, they're just going to go back to talking about Martin Luther King 24/7. That is part of that. And it is a lack of ambition. It's a lack of, just looking into the past. And it's just like goofy. It is an indication of just like how radical things change, as if the ideal society is just an earlier version of the madness that we have today, but being less extreme and less up in your face and much more accommodating to, having your own little breathing space from it. The problems we have today were still then there. Like, this has been a long-term struggle. It wasn't just something that America was perfect just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or what have you. Like, this has been a long process extending back to the 1930s with the New Deal, and you could even argue it a little bit before. And it's just carried on and become more extreme, more radical over time. And you just can't hit the rewind button. We need a grand ambition of of the type of American society we want, and you just can't just like show Friends as like the ideal American society, or just like you being an 8-year-old and not having responsibilities and just like playing N64 all day. That is not the peak of American life. It may have been the peak in your life, but it's not something you build a political ideology around. And it's the society that we had in the 90s. Still full, as I want to say, is still full with all the same problems that we had now. Divorce, dysfunctional families, degenerate culture, rap music was still very popular. Everything you think is seen as a problem now was there back then. It's just not as extreme or as extensive as we have today. So this is not an argument saying that like everything's always been bad, everything's always sucked. We're just wanting to return to the 12th century or something. That's not what we're saying. We're simply saying you need to look at these things rationally and not just think that because Third Eye Blind was on the radio that like America was perfect. And that's like too many times what people like to uphold and see as the worth. I mean, political correctness was defined in the 90s as much as wokeness defines today. The only difference is that liberals were a little bit more willing to condemn it than they are today, but it was still having an impact, still influencing our society. Civil rights regime was still in place, still dictating racial quotas. They actually, thanks to Republicans, they increased mass immigration in the early 90s. Still had that problem, still in the process of diversifying, and we had a president who thought that a majority America would be amazing and epic and the third grand revolution of our time. And these are the things you have to admit about the 90s. And other differences I would say is that probably our political leadership was less insane. I think you had more people, I think throughout the 90s is the one good thing is that everyone agreed that you needed tougher policing and to be tough on criminals, which today everyone, half of the political leadership believes that we should just allow criminals to do whatever they want and this will lead to greater safety. That is one thing I would say. There's a bunch of other things that I would say have changed. There was also much more overwhelming opposition of reparations in the 90s, which today, unless something radical changes in that time, I could see us passing reparations maybe in the next decade. There's already states doing that. California is doing reparations, so it's not that far off from the federal government doing it. So as people like to say, the answer to 1984 is 1776. I don't think the answer to 1984 is 1999. There's nothing wrong with saying like how things are different and pointing out the differences between now and 20 years ago. I do this a lot as well. But then pretending that this one age is a golden era and then getting extremely mad if anyone points out and says the facts and saying like, well, no, it's not a golden era. Same problems existed then as today. People shouldn't be that sensitive about it. It's time to offer a brand new vision. We're looking to the future, not to the past, even though we can look to the past and see what went wrong and what was right and the differences between today. We really have to be forward thinking, not stuck in the past and not trying to hit the rewind button to 1999. Next topic I want to discuss is Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. A lot of controversy over this. It was confirmed that she's going to go to Taiwan and make a big splash there. China has threatened to, or at least some officials have threatened to shoot her down if she approaches to Taiwan. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're just going to, get mad and send some threats and not act on them like China always does. And they do this. A lot of conservatives are now pro Nancy Pelosi because she's doing this brave move to visit Taiwan, and we need to all celebrate her for standing with the Taiwanese against the Chinese threat. And I'm in a minority here, or at least a minority, but some of my viewers may agree with me. I think this is like really stupid, the whole thing. First off, there's no point to her going to Taiwan. It's just an unnecessary provocation. It's not like it'll be like the Chinese are defeated by Nancy Pelosi showing up with her fake tits at the at the Taiwanese. You know what? It's like, and she's not even gonna know what country she's in. She's already suffering from the same mental problems that are, declining or aging problems that Joe Biden has. Like, what is accomplished here by Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan? It's an unnecessary provocation. People are saying, well, we need to provoke them anyway. For what gain? What are you gaining? Is Taiwan now saved from Chinese invasion by Nancy Pelosi visiting? No. But I mean, the Chinese are probably being a little too sensitive, and it's more of like a face saving measure to show that we won't back down on Chinese threats. So she's going there. But it's stupid to even go in the first place. I mean, it's an unnecessary provocation, and that's not how you run diplomacy. So that's one reason for this. The other thing is a point is that a lot of conservatives, if you do any type of anti-China stuff, they forget any problems you have, and they become extremely pro this person or figure who's anti-China. It's like Enes Kanter. Now Enes Kanter Freedom, who was this Turkish basketball player who was pro BLM, all these pro standard progressive issues, but then he became a China opponent, and he made Winnie the Pooh tennis shoes, and they're like, wow, this guy is based. We love Enes Kanter Freedom, and then he became a conservative star, and they just love this guy, ate him up. And so if any Democrat wants to win over Republicans, they just have to say, I oppose China, and it's like, we will stand with Taiwan to the death. And like, yes, we love this. The Chi-Coms are on retreating in the face of Bob Menendez saying that he hates China. I don't know if Bob Menendez is a real China hawk, but China hawkery does do that. And a lot of this hawkish stuff, and a lot of Republicans are still, ordinary conservatives are still like huge Ukraine fans, and they think that Russia needs to be crushed. And there's all these Republicans last week who were giving these speeches, like Joni Ernst and others, who are talking about Russia, and it's like, we've got to bloody them, we've got to make them crippled, and that we defeat them so bad that they'll never try this again. And it's like, they're using very violent, visceral language to describe the Russians, when all these people, if they have a real problem before them, such as BLM rioting throughout every city, they use the most milquetoast language possible. Like Joni Ernst, when she talks about the border invasion, she's like, oh, these people, they're crossing the border, and that's a problem. It's very measured rhetoric, very mild tone, and that's a real problem that we have millions of people streaming across our border. But when it comes to Russia, it's like, we're going to torture them to death. Like these Ruskies are going to meet their maker, and they're going to draw a bloody stump from messing with us. And it's a very strong language that they use. And they try to do this with China too. The left is not as eager to be anti-China because they're a non-white power. I mean, it's like, and they associate it with Republicans and conservatives being anti-China, but you do see a few liberals who are into this. I mean, obviously Nancy Pelosi, and also the entire national security establishment is also extremely anti-China. But for a lot of the rank and file liberals, they don't really care. I mean, they don't care that China's influencing Hollywood, China's influencing sports leagues, China's influencing corporate policy, and they just don't care. But Russia really riles them up because Russia is seen as this great, evil, white, fascist state. I mean, Russians are predominantly white, and Chinese are not. And so they do, and all these people fell for this idea that calling COVID Wuhan virus or the China virus, was racist, and we have to ban it. And even this policy, there's this wanting to be tougher on China. But the Department of Justice shut down an initiative to try to look out for Chinese spies and infiltrators in America because it was deemed racist. They did this earlier this year. And it's like they just well, we're going to do this in a very non-racist way. And there's all these examples of Chinese nationals or Chinese immigrants coming over and then just spying on America. And we have this problem with students and to anyone entering our workforce. It's a major problem. But there is no talk of just halting Chinese immigration over these espionage threats. Instead, any initiative to combat these espionage threats, they end them because it's racist to even worry about that. So they're not even serious about China threat. None of the things that are proposed to respond to China or are serious. They're just like these PR moves that are just like, we're going to send our Speaker of the House to Taiwan. What does that do? We're gonna have free Hong Kong signs at NBA games. What the hell does that do? Are we going to try to bring back our manufacturing? No. Are we going to try to punish corporations that send their manufacturing over to China? No. Are we going to limit Chinese immigration? No, that's racist. Are we going to, make Chinese, are we going to stop hiring Chinese immigrants and nationals or people with dual citizenship with China, and we're going to stop giving them sensitive jobs where they can then spy and steal our secrets and give them to China? No, that's racist. So are we going to try to even end our economic dependence on China? No. And so all this is like very ridiculous. I mean, even like the most popular social media app for teenagers is Chinese, like TikTok. And conservatives will come out and be like, oh, we're very anti-TikTok, but they don't propose any solutions to it. They're just like signal that they're against TikTok. And TikTok is like just getting bigger and bigger all the time. And it is like it's already passed like YouTube for amount of like users and like and bandwidth that it has. And so, this is Chinese run social media outlet. And there's no real solutions to anything that about the codependence between America and China. And I always say like the idea of a Cold War with China is like in the type of Cold War we have the Soviet Union is pretty ridiculous. I mean, imagine if like the Soviet Union had the most popular cable news network, or not that like let me rephrase that because there wasn't even really cable news for a lot of the Cold War, but just like one of the three network channels that we had, Russia or the Soviet Union ran the most popular one. And let's say that Russia also, the Soviet Union, that a large percentage of our manufacturing base was in the Soviet Union. And let's even just say that all of our corporations seem to prefer the Soviet Union to America. And that would be the situation that you would have. And also our sports leagues all go and apologize and kiss the ring of the Soviet Union. That's the type of situation we have with China today. And even to add, like all our movies now have to be made with a Chinese audience in mind, and in some ways, with the Chinese audience holding greater primacy than the American audience. Some ways this is good because you're not going to have as much degeneracy as you would see in an American, specifically American-made film, but it's also going to just like be a dumber product. And so this is like the nature. Is like, you couldn't imagine this with the Soviet Union. You couldn't imagine having these type of hostilities with that. Now, there's been examples of countries having this type of relationships, like strong relationships, and still going to war. I mean, Britain was like using German industrial products before World War One. They still went to war, but I don't even think it's like to the same extent. Really, what a lot of this China stuff is about just like getting red state Americans to rally to the globalist American empire and to get them loyal to it, and saying like, oh, well, we may have all these problems in America and Democrats are doing terrible things, but at the end of the day, we're all just Americans and we all need to unite against the Chi-Coms, against the CCP. And Republicans fall for it. Democrats don't. I mean, Democrats still see their primary enemy as, these white yokels who just won't die. That is their primary enemy. They don't fall for this trick. But conservatives do. And so they will say, like, thanks, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is a much bigger problem for middle Americans than China is. I mean, that's like the fact. I mean, much more direct problem for us than China. I mean, is China pushing anti-white racism indoctrination to our children? No, it's America. Is China supporting BLM riots? No, it's our own leaders. Is America, involved in these stupid, or is China making us do these stupid foreign policy decisions? No, it's our own people. And they do this a lot with, they always try to blame China for things that, it's our own leaders, it's our own establishment who are doing. Like they try to blame the BLM riots on China, or even on Russia. No, it was our own leadership. It's like our military endorsed the BLM riots. Like, it wasn't China behind this. I was even seeing conservatives blame like America's population woes on China. It's like, no, it's our own leaders pushing this stuff. And I think it just makes for an easier culprit to blame an outside enemy rather than like our internal leadership for these problems, and it just makes it for an easier target. But no, it's coming from within the house, not outside the house, and that's something you just have to keep in mind. And so, like, I'm no China fan. Like, China does suck. It is a problem that they're growing stronger and more powerful. And I'm not one of these people who are like, oh, base China, standing up to global homo and stuff, and like whatever that people want to say. I'm not like in that boat, but at the same time, I can realize that like the leadership of the globalist American empire will occasionally put China on a pedestal and pinpoint it so they can convince middle Americans to get to display loyalty to the globalist American empire and say like, oh look, this is our real enemy, it's China. Oh wow, we're gonna do something that doesn't matter, and we're still gonna be dependent on them, but we're going to make you rally around us so you can stand against the real enemy. And then in exchange for that loyalty, we're going to continue to push our nefarious ideology, our nefarious agenda on the American public. And that's really what they want to do. So it's better to stay focused on Nancy Pelosi than to ally with Nancy Pelosi, claim we're all Americans, and then just say our real enemy is China. No, I would say our real enemy is the people or people at home, not China. Not China. I mean, China is not our friend. China is an enemy, but I don't think it's not a direct problem that we have or that we do have with our own elites. And I think the elites are going to just use the China as a ruse to win loyalty from people who should not be loyal to the globalist American empire. And they'll bamboozle us once again. And they did this with the Iraq War. They always like to do this, is like rally to the colors, and then they continue to destroy our country from within. So don't fall for the trick. Don't fall for the bait. The last thing I want to talk about is Orban, or Viktor Orban, delivering a very keyed speech it was actually delivered in Romania, I believe, not actually Hungary, last week, and people freaking out about it and what that means. And this speech was really good. It was one of the best speeches I've read from a head of state in a long time. It was like full of history. It was actually not talking down to his audience. It was not filled with platitudes. It was like a serious historical analysis of the problems facing the West and what to do about them. And, it was pointing out about how, America thinks that they can come to these Eastern European countries and dictate, the terms and conditions of how they run themselves, and how Orban doesn't want to do that. He also talked about the stupidity of the continuation of this Ukraine-Russia war, and how it's going to be devastating the West the further on it's continued, and we need peace. And most importantly, he's talking about the threat that mass immigration and the great replacement pose to the West. And he endorses Jean Raspel's, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but you know what I'm saying, Jean Raspel's famous Camp of the Saints. He endorses it in a major speech. I think this might be the first time a head of state has ever endorsed Camp of the Saints. And he's like, this is a brilliant book. This lays it all out. And Camp of the Saints is a very good book. I recommend it. Well, I'll do a IQ supplement on it someday, but I think if you haven't read it before, I highly recommend reading it. And so does Viktor Orban now. But his whole speech is like incredible. Like, you're reading it, it's like, I cannot imagine an American politician ever delivering such a speech. Trump had some good speeches, but Trump, I guess maybe it's like the way that American politicians have to operate. They kind of talk on a dumbed down level to like make everything very obvious and stuff. And the speech he was delivering is just like something you could have seen like an academic or an intellectual give at like a small conference. Like the way it went through processes and like the way the world works. But really what caused the most controversy was not just him talking about, he's very clear that he acknowledges race in his speech. And he was very clear that, Europe is not just a set of culture or ideas. There's a people there, and they're getting replaced by non-Europeans, and that's a threat to the West, and that's a threat to Europe. And that's something that, even right-wingers who will sometimes celebrate Viktor Orban will be hesitant about, particularly American conservatives. And then he went on about how we don't want to be a mixed-race country, we oppose this idea of mixing races and stuff. And that's really what caught people off guard. They're like, oh, oh no, you can't say that, Viktor Orban. That's a race. We're just people. We're just values and ideas. Racism, that's a liberalism. Some of his fans would have said. So Orban got into hot water for this. And I mean, they can't really cancel out a state, I guess, unless we want to topple him. But I don't think they're going to topple him over saying, we don't want to mix race Hungary. And he said this, and I mean, the only punishments that could have come from American conservatives. But I mean, he's going to speak at CPAC Texas in, I think, a few weeks, or maybe even sooner than that. I'm not sure when the conference is. He's set to keynote, and they're not disinviting him over the speech. Even as supporters awkwardly came to his support, like people like Rod Dreher and others who were like, oh well, he didn't really mean race the American way, and it's like, I read it, I think he did. But that's what they're going along. But I think the two things to take away from this is some people have been critical of Orban for some of the cucky and cringe allies that he's making in America and the West, inviting all these type of post-liberal cucks like Rod Dreher, Patrick Deneen, and all these people to come there. And I wrote an article that got published in Revolver last week, critiquing Patrick Deneen, who's this Notre Dame law professor who wrote Why Liberalism Failed. And he's always talking about the evils of liberalism. But what he's proposing is something that's pretty liberal, or I mean, liberalism is never really properly defined. And generally, what he supports is that he claims that white identity politics is a state-sponsored initiative to distract people from the real issues, which is uniting the multiracial working class to demand unionization of DoorDash drivers. I mean, that's really what he's about, and it's just silly. And these are the people he's trying to cultivate rather than anybody who's particularly good. But even with that aside, Orban clearly doesn't share their politics, and his ideas are more in line with the dissident right and nationalists than they are with these people like Compact Magazine and Sohrab Ahmari and those types. He has far more in common with the dissident right than he does with them. But I mean, he's not giving us free trips to Hungary yet. Maybe someday. We'll have to hope. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is that that's a praise of Orban. And Orban is significantly better than the Polish government. The Polish government is just an offshoot of the globalist American empire. They hate Russia more than they care about mass migration. And they pretty much want more American troops there. They want to be more dependent on America and the EU just because they hate Russia that much. I mean, they have historical animosity, clearly warranted historical animosity towards Russia, but they're not a real state with its own sovereignty. Meanwhile, Hungary is forging a more independent path. They don't really have the power to be fully independent because it's a small Eastern European country, but it's trying its best to do so. And Orban is arguably the most keyed figure. I almost said base, but most keyed figure in Europe. I would say he's even more of our guy than, a lot of people like to look towards Putin, but Putin, there's interesting things about Putin, but Putin, there's also a lot of suspicious things about Putin, and Putin I would not say is our guy or something, but I would say Orban is our guy, and this is proved by the speech. I highly recommend everyone read it if you can get a hold of it. It's a very good speech. I think it's on the level of Putin's speeches he delivered before Ukraine, even though I would say that those speeches weren't necessarily to our interests or expressing our ideas, but the type of level of insight and historical knowledge and, not talking down to its audience, talking to its audience in a highbrow manner, and while not being completely boring, was a breath of fresh air in the speech. The other thing about Orban's speech, and this confirms my point in the Revolver article that you guys should read that I wrote about Patrick Deneen, about how, it's saying that identity politics are not a distraction from economic concerns. They are the real concern, more so than economic concerns, at least from a nationalist perspective. And Orban really situated that out in his speech. And it creates a discomfort for these post-liberals who want to imagine that this whole nationalist upsurge And I'm no longer using populist upsurge because if you guys listened to last week's IQ supplement, you should learn from me and Nigel Carlsbad why we should avoid using the term populist to describe ourselves. So just go ahead and listen to that. I'm giving a lot of promotions here. Read my Revolver column and listen to last week's IQ supplement. But this nationalist upsurge was not driven by economic anxiety and the desire to push economic populism or family credits and an industrial policy. It was driven by fears that the West is no longer going to be the West, that the people who made the West are being replaced, that the way our societies have been for generations, that our traditional way of life is going to be replaced by a new people. And with a new people cannot, or if the people who made the West what it is are replaced, it's no longer going to be the West. And that is the core principle of what we're about, and that was what was expressed in Orban's speech. And that is a discomforting fact for all these respectable post-liberals and economic populists and what have you, these populist types who just want to imagine that it's some respectable, like, anti-liberal, which means nothing. And we're avoiding white identity politics. It's all a ruse. It's all something, a distraction from the real issues. And then Orban reminded his audience in his epic speech that no, these identity politics are what matter. Economics are important, but it's not necessarily driven by the economics suggested by populism. So that's my thoughts on the Orban speech. I think it's like a massive white pill. I think people have been talking to me about, I'm offering too many black pills and such. But I think Orban himself, like him having a massive victory in the spring for his government, despite this massive opposition coming from globalist forces, coming from George Soros, the American government, the EU, the EU passing sanctions, Ukraine basically telling the people to vote against Orban, and Orban surviving and winning, and him, delivering all these incredible speeches after his victory. He, in his inaugural speech, when the new government was inaugurated, I think this was in May, he essentially endorsed the Great Replacement theory as well. Probably also the first head of state to do that. And now he's just getting more keyed in all of his speeches and stuff following the victory. And it's very good to know that there is somebody who is like us, who is in charge of a state and offering a model for the rest of the West. I don't think we could replicate Hungary in America, but I think it is just a white pill that there's somebody out there doing something positive for his people and showing an alternative way for Europeans. I think it's more of a model for Europeans than Americans, but it's still something to be inspired by and be white pilled about. So that's my one white pill I want to offer in this discussion. And so people always want to accuse me of being black pilled and saying everything's dumb, and it's like, I don't think so. Look to Orban. I think that's a very positive example for us. So now going to the Cognitive Elite section. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And if you haven't already, make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. The last week's episode was very good, as I keep recommending it, that I had with Nigel Carlsbad. And we're going to have another incredible episode this week. So I want to get to the Cognitive Elite question. This one comes from JB. He asks, "Hi Scott, a lot of dissident right people, including you I believe, say that we cannot use the same tactics as the left. This is probably true for a lot of their tactics, but one I don't know if I've heard you comment on is lawfare. Are there any right-wing organizations like the ADL, SPLC, ACLU? Is it even a viable way for the right, dissident right?" Well, the first thing I want to correct is I haven't necessarily said that we can't use left-wing tactics. It's more that things that the left can rely on, like these slurs that carry a lot of power, or epithets that they use, like racist, sexist, homophobe. We really can't use our own to counter that, like saying, like, even though I'm not that critical of groomer, but I don't think demon carries the same resonance in our society as racist does. That's my main argument. So it's not necessarily we can't use their tactics, but there are certain powers and advantages that they have that we can't replicate. Now, when it comes to the issue of lawfare, I'm a huge supporter of it. There's a couple groups that are starting to do this, like America First Legal, which is Stephen Miller's group. that have been suing a lot over anti-white discrimination and a lot of these school issues and critical race theory, and they've been having a lot of success with that. They've got they got a judge to halt the Biden administration trying to restrict how they divvied up government funds and excluding white males from it. So they've got that stopped, and they've had some success suing over critical race theory in school. And so have a couple of other groups as well that I'm not sure that America First Legal was affiliated with. And also, a lot of the immigration policies that the Biden administration is trying to implement, has been halted in court or been delayed in court. They had a deportation moratorium for when they first came into office for 100 days. That was stopped by the state attorney generals, mainly Ken Paxton in Texas, suing over that. Remain in Mexico was re-implemented due to being sued over in court, even though the Supreme Court then eventually ruled in favor of Biden. And there's a bunch of other rules that they've had a lot of success with going in the courts. So lawfare is very effective, actually. I wouldn't even say this is a left-wing tactic. I think it's rather nonpartisan. We should use it more often. This is like the type of ways that I talk about, like using the process that is there and using that for positive gain rather than like dwelling on fantasies that aren't going to happen. Like, it's much more effective for people to put in resources towards lawfare than it is to just tweet incessantly about how civil war is coming. Lawfare, you'll actually have results. As America First Legal shows, as these lawsuits filed by these state attorney generals against Biden and his immigration policies. Also, a lot of the COVID stuff was defeated in court as well. The lockdown stuff. So lawfare is actually a very effective tactic. It's open to us. It's not a guaranteed success. You do have to deal with a lot of liberal judges or judges who are afraid to do these things. But you do have a chance for success, and investing more resources into it is important. And a big reason that these Antifa guys get off is that they have their own like lawyers guild that comes and bails them out. I think it's the National Lawyers Guild that comes and does them free representation. So it's always like they throw out cases against them because these guys are lawyered up. And the main reason that they don't throw out cases against the right, well, one, they want to ensure that they're in jail rather than Antifa, is that a lot of these guys don't have legal representation. So using lawfare, and just having lawyers on your side is extremely important in our society. We're a litigious society. We are a society that likes to follow everything by the law and ensure that everything is going by their law. And judges have tremendous power in this country, and you really have to play to that factor in our society when going about change. And just think about how much the left has accomplished through lawfare. I mean, they got gay marriage legalized through lawfare. And we could have similar things done to our effect. I mean, lawfare worked for the pro-life movement. I mean, they accomplished what they've set out to do for 50 years. Maybe it took them a little bit too long, but they've eventually accomplished it through a lawfare, through, eventually getting conservative justices in place to rule in their favor. And next year, we could see the same happen with affirmative action, and that's being accomplished through lawfare as well. So I'm a huge proponent of lawfare. I don't think it's a left-wing tactic, and I'm not that opposed to us appropriating left-wing tactics. I just think that we don't have the same advantages of the left, and that's usually what people like to imagine. Rather than talking about left-wing tactics, they instead say that we should imagine we have the left's advantages and just use what they're doing for that rather than tactics. I'm not opposed to that, but I don't think lawfare is a left-wing tactic. I mean, right-wingers and conservatives have been using it for years and years and years. It's just that the left has been more effective at it in recent years, but that could be changing in the Biden years. So fully endorse it. I think it's an effective tactic, and we're seeing results over the last 2 years with it. So I support it. So that's it. I guess that's it for today. That is it for our questions. So I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. We're, of course, going to have an incredible IQ supplement later this week and an incredible episode next week. So tune in for that. As always, it will be on Monday. So until next time, stay respected.